I want you to think about the last time someone told you that you weren't enough. Not in words necessarily. Sometimes it's a look, a dismissal, the way someone turns their back on you like you don't even register in the same room, like your furniture, like your background noise. Now imagine that feeling, but the someone doing it isn't a person. It's a civilization, ancient, vast, spanning 47 star systems and 712 inhabited worlds. A civilization so old that when our ancestors were still figuring out fire, they had already mapped the dark matter filaments holding galaxies together. A civilization that had watched us from a distance, the way you might watch an ant colony before deciding whether to step on it or simply redirect your path. Imagine that civilization coming to Earth. Not with war, not with weapons blazing in the sky and cities burning on every continent. That would have been almost easier to understand, honestly. Humans know war. We've been doing it to each other since before we had words for it. We know how to respond to an enemy with guns. But they didn't come with guns. They came with a document. A legal document, technically. 712 pages of it, translated into 43 Earth languages simultaneously, the moment it was broadcast into our global communication networks. It arrived on a Tuesday morning. I remember that specifically because I was eating cereal, the cheap kind with the cartoon bird on the box, and my phone lit up with an emergency notification, the kind you only ever see for earthquakes and tornadoes. Except this notification said something different. It said, "First contact protocol initiated. All civilians advised to remain calm." I remember looking at those words and thinking, they're telling us to remain calm, which means something happened that should absolutely make us the opposite of calm. I was right. And what happened next? What humanity did, what we said, when the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy told us to kneel? That's the story I want to tell you today. Chapter 2, The World That Woke Up to Something New. Let me set the scene for you, not the science fiction version, the real version, the version that actually happened. It was 2041. Not the 2041 of old movies, flying cars everywhere and robot butlers handing you cocktails. It was more complicated than that, and more interesting. We'd solved some things and broken others. Climate restructuring was underway. That's what they called it, restructuring, like we were just rearranging furniture rather than trying to undo decades of damage to the only planet we had. The coastal cities that remained had seawall systems you had to see to believe, massive titanium-reinforced barriers that hummed with tidal energy conversion units, turning the ocean's own force into power for the very walls holding it back. There was something almost poetic about that, depending on your mood. The Sahara Greening Project had turned 11% of the northern Sahara into functional agricultural zones. It took 23 years and the combined effort of 40 nations, and it still wasn't finished. But wheat was growing in places where nothing had grown for centuries, and that felt like something worth holding on to. We had quantum communications infrastructure that made the old internet look like tin cans connected by string. Data moved instantly between continents. Not fast, instantly. The latency was effectively zero. You could have a surgery performed remotely from 6,000 miles away with robotic precision guided by a surgeon sitting in another country, watching through haptic feedback gloves and a display that showed them the patient's body in three-dimensional thermal relief. We had fusion reactors, plural, actual working ones, powering 17 major metropolitan areas. The jokes about fusion always being 30 years away had finally, mercifully, stopped being accurate. And we had the SETI array. The new one, I mean, not the old radio telescope networks. The Unified Deep Space Listening Array, which was the most expensive single scientific project in human history up to that point. 947 connected receiver stations spread across Earth's surface, supplemented by 42 orbital stations, all coordinated by an AI system we'd named Echo. Its full designation was Extended Communications and Hypothesis Observer, but nobody called it that. It was just Echo. Echo had been listening for 11 years. And Echo was the one that heard them first. Not a radio signal, not the kind of structured mathematical message the old SETI researchers had theorized about. Echo detected a coherent pattern in the quantum foam, background noise that's everywhere in space, everywhere in the universe, the low-level static of reality itself, and that pattern was structured, intentionally structured, the way a drum beat is structured, not random, deliberate. Echo flagged it at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Monday night, technically Tuesday morning, and immediately escalated it through the emergency protocol chain. Within 40 minutes, 6 different governments had been notified. Within 2 hours, the Secretary General of the United Nations was on a secure call with the heads of state of the 12 largest economies on Earth. Within 6 hours they arrived. I use that word arrived loosely. They didn't land on Earth, they didn't need to. The signal that Echo detected wasn't a precursor or a greeting. It was an installation. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the Galactic Council had already established what they called a presence node. That was their translation, which we later understood was a significant dumbing down of a concept for which we had no existing word, in geosynchronous orbit above the coordinates that the signal had specified. It appeared as a sphere approximately 300 meters in diameter, perfectly smooth, a color that shifted depending on what wavelength of light you measured it in: dark gray in visible spectrum, intensely bright in infrared, nearly transparent in ultraviolet. It just sat there and it hummed. Not in sound, there's no sound in space, but in a frequency that the orbital monitoring stations could detect, and that, when converted to audio, sounded like nothing so much as a very deep, very slow exhale. Like something breathing out. Like something patient. The broadcast came 8 hours after the sphere appeared. 712 pages, 43 languages, simultaneous global transmission. It hijacked every connected communication network on the planet simultaneously: radio, internet, quantum comm, even some closed military systems that were theoretically unhackable. It just arrived, the way sunlight arrives, not asking permission. I read it. Well, I read the summary that got posted online. The full document took a legal team at the UN nearly 3 weeks to fully analyze, and even then they weren't certain they'd understood all of it correctly. But the summary was clear enough. The Galactic Council, formal name, the interstellar governing collective of recognized civilizations, which nobody used because it was terrible, was the governing body of 47 star systems. They had been aware of Earth for a long time, a very long time. They had watched us develop. They had cataloged our resources, our capabilities, our conflicts, and our trajectory. And they had determined that Earth had now reached what they called minimum viable awareness. Our technology had crossed a threshold beyond which we could no longer be classified as a pre-contact civilization. Which meant we were now subject to Council jurisdiction. Which meant we were expected to acknowledge that jurisdiction. Which meant we were expected to pay tribute. Let me tell you what tribute meant. Tribute was not a suggestion. The document made that clear in several different ways and several different languages, using several different cultural frameworks that the Council had apparently studied in advance to make sure there was no ambiguity. Tribute was not a tax or a trade agreement or a friendly welcome gift. Tribute was a formal acknowledgement of hierarchy. An admission that the Council stood above you. A promise to provide, at regular intervals, whatever the Council determined was appropriate: resources, labor, intellectual property, raw materials, territorial access. The first tribute demand was specific. 42,000 tons of refined helium-3, deliverable within 18 Earth months. The council had identified our lunar mining operations, still in their early stages, still barely profitable, and had determined that we could provide this without significant disruption to our own energy programs. They were wrong about that, but that was almost beside the point. The point was the word tribute. The point was that they weren't asking. And the point was what Earth decided to say back. Chapter 3: The Room Where It Happened. I wasn't in that room. I want to be honest about that. This story, the way I'm telling it, comes from people who were. From the recordings that were declassified 2 years later. From the testimony of the people who sat at that table and had to make the decision that echoed, no pun intended, across the next decade of human history. But I've read every word of those transcripts. I've watched every second of the footage that was released. I've spoken with 3 of the people who were present, and I can tell you this. The room itself was unremarkable. That's the first thing everyone who was there mentions. You'd think a meeting like this would happen somewhere grand, something that matched the scale of the moment. But the emergency council session was held in Conference Room B at the United Nations headquarters in New York. A room with fluorescent lighting, and a slightly scuffed conference table, and a water cooler in the corner that made a gurgling sound every few minutes that one delegate reportedly found intensely distracting. 73 people in that room. Heads of state, their advisors, the heads of every major scientific organization on Earth, military commanders from the 12 largest defense forces, and 3 representatives from civilian society, a philosopher, a poet, and rather unexpectedly, a civil engineer from Bangalore named Dr. Priya Venkataraman, who had been invited because she'd written the most widely circulated academic paper on the physics of the Council's presence node, and was therefore, as one general put it, the person who probably understood what we were actually dealing with better than any of us. Dr. Venkataraman would later say that she felt completely out of her depth the entire time. She said she sat there for the first hour thinking that she was going to say something wrong and accidentally start a war. She said her hands didn't stop shaking for 3 days. She also said that she was the one who finally proposed the 3 words. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The debate in that room lasted 11 hours. 11 hours with breaks for coffee and bathroom, and at hour 6, a brief interruption when one of the Korean delegate's security staff had a panic attack and had to be escorted out. Nobody blamed him. The stress in that room was the kind that had a physical weight to it. You could feel it, the witnesses say, like pressure behind the eyes. The debate covered everything. There were people who said they should comply, pay the tribute, acknowledge the jurisdiction, buy time. These were not cowards. These were pragmatists, people who'd looked at the data and understood that the Council's technological advantage over humanity was so vast that resistance, conventional resistance, was a mathematical absurdity. One general, American 4-star, a man who had fought in 3 conventional conflicts and was not given to emotional language, said, quietly, that sending our best weapons against a civilization that could install a sphere in orbit without us noticing, until it was already there, would be like throwing a handful of gravel at a tsunami. He wasn't wrong. There were people who said they should stall. Accept the demand in principle, begin negotiations, drag it out, use the time to accelerate our own technology programs, see if we could find allies among other species who might have their own grievances against the Council. This was the diplomatic strategy. It had merit. It also, as the philosopher, a woman named Dr. Adiz Akafor, Nigerian, 61 years old, who wore reading glasses she constantly forgot on top of her head, pointed out, carried a fundamental problem. We would be agreeing to the premise, Dr. Akafor said, even if only tactically, and the premise is that we can be told to kneel. Once you accept that premise, even provisionally, it's very difficult to unaccept it later. Then there were people who said they should refuse. Flat refusal. No, get out. This is our planet and our solar system, and we are not subjects, and we do not pay tribute to anyone. This position had a certain emotional clarity to it. It was also, the general pointed out, not a strategy so much as a statement, and statements without the power to back them up are just words into a void. And that's when Dr. Venkataraman said something. She hadn't spoken much. She'd mostly listened, taking notes on a tablet, asking clarifying questions. When she spoke at hour 9, exhausted and pale, her voice was quieter than most people expected from someone who'd just spent 9 hours surrounded by world leaders and generals. She said, "What if the words themselves are the power?" People turned to look at her. She explained. The council had spent considerable time studying humanity. We knew this from the document itself, which referenced data collected over what appeared to be several centuries of observation. They had studied our languages, our conflicts, our social structures, our biology, our resource consumption, our art, our science. They had prepared translations into 43 languages. They had calibrated their tribute demand carefully, choosing something we could technically provide, making it difficult for us to claim incapability. They had, in short, studied us. But studying something from a distance and understanding it are different things. Dr. Venkataraman had spent her career studying things from a distance, modeling structures, calculating loads, predicting failures. And she'd learned something fundamental. No matter how good your model is, reality has a way of surprising you, because the thing you're studying isn't a static object. It responds. It adapts. And sometimes the most important thing about it is something you can't measure from a distance. They've studied what we've done, she said. They haven't studied what we are. So let's show them. The room was very quiet. 3 words, she said, and I think we all know what they should be. Chapter 4, the words. I'm going to pause here for a second because I want to make sure you understand the weight of what I'm about to tell you. When the United Nations officially responded to the Galactic Council's tribute demand, they did not submit a diplomatic counter-proposal. They did not send a lengthy legal document. They did not request clarification or additional time. They did not offer a conditional acceptance. They did not begin the negotiating process that every single political expert had assumed from the moment the Council's document arrived that humanity would inevitably pursue. They sent 3 words. Those 3 words were transmitted back through the quantum foam frequency that ECHO had originally detected the Council's signal on. They were packaged in a data format that mirrored the Council's own transmission protocol, something ECHO had reverse-engineered in the 11 hours between the signal's arrival and the scheduled response window. 3 words. In 106 languages simultaneously, including 17, that the Council's own translation matrix hadn't included in their original communication, languages they apparently hadn't considered worth accounting for. 3 words, broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, from the surface of the planet to the sphere hanging silent in orbit above the planet, from the quantum communications arrays to the ECHO network, to every radio transmitter on Earth operating at full power all at once. The words were, "We don't kneel." That was it. That was humanity's response to the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. We don't kneel. Now let me tell you what happened next. Because the story doesn't end with the words. The words were only the beginning. The words were the first move in a game that nobody had written the rules for yet. A game that would take 3 years to play out and would change everything, not just for Earth, but for every civilization in the Council's jurisdiction. The words were the spark. But the fire was something we'd been building for a long time without knowing it. Chapter 5, the silence that followed. 48 hours. That's how long the Council took to respond. 48 hours of the sphere hanging in orbit, silent, while the entire planet below it collectively held its breath. 48 hours of news broadcasts running 24 hours a day, of governments quietly mobilizing military assets, not because they thought it would help, but because sitting still was psychologically impossible, of scientists staring at monitoring screens watching for any change in the sphere's electromagnetic signature. 48 hours of people going to work and cooking dinner, and helping their kids with homework, because life doesn't actually stop even when everything important is happening, and the mundane persistence of ordinary human life in the face of something incomprehensible is, I think, one of the most human things there is. I remember those 48 hours. I remember the feeling of walking outside and looking up at a clear night sky and knowing, not guessing, not imagining that there was something up there looking back. It does something to you, that knowledge. It restructures things, makes the scale of your personal worries feel different, not smaller exactly, more proportional maybe, like you suddenly have the right reference frame for everything. My neighbor, an older man, retired, used to work on the old seawall construction projects, came outside and stood next to me on the second night. We stood there for a while without saying anything. He had a cup of tea. I had, I think, a glass of water. Finally he said, in the tone of voice you use when you're stating something obvious that nobody has said yet, "Funny thing about people. Tell them they can't do something and watch what happens." He went back inside. I kept standing there. The council's response, when it came, was not what anyone expected. Most people, most experts, most strategists, most analysts had predicted one of two responses: either a threat, escalating the pressure to comply, or silence, the kind that meant they were preparing something. The diplomatic contingent had hoped for a counter-proposal. The military contingent had prepared for the worst. What came was a question. Not a demand, not a threat. A single question, transmitted through the same quantum foam frequency as before, translated again into 43 languages, arriving in every connected device on the planet simultaneously. The question was, do you understand what you are refusing? I've thought about that question a lot over the years. There's something almost human about it, the way it's phrased, the implication behind it, the assumption that our refusal must be based on ignorance, that if we truly understood the scale of the council, the power they represented, the consequences of defying them, we would of course reconsider. We would, naturally, come to our senses. It's the question you ask when you're not angry yet, when you're still in the phase of thinking the other party has simply made an error in judgment. It's the question you ask right before you stop thinking that. Earth's response came much faster this time, only 4 hours of deliberation, because this question, unlike the tribute demand, had an obvious answer, an answer that Dr. Akafor said was the easiest thing she'd ever voted for in her life. Yes. One word this time. Yes, we understand what we are refusing. We are not refusing out of ignorance. We are not refusing because we miscalculated. We are refusing because we chose to. And then they attached something to the transmission. Something that nobody outside the conference room had known about. Something that had been built in secret over the 14 months since Echo first detected the council's background noise presence, not in the quantum foam, but in our own systems. Little patterns that kept showing up, too structured to be coincidence, too subtle to trigger any alerts. 14 months of the council quietly watching, 14 months of us without knowing it being observed. The UN team had known for 6 months. They had discovered the embedded monitoring signals and had made a decision. Don't remove them. Don't alert the council that they'd been found. Let them think they were still watching in secret. And let them see something worth watching. Chapter 6. What we showed them. The attachment was a file. Not a diplomatic document, not a legal brief, not a counter-proposal. A file that contained, compressed into a format that Echo had determined the council's systems could read, 14 months of curated human life. Let me explain what I mean by that. After the UN team discovered the embedded monitoring signals, they made a decision about what to do with them. They couldn't remove the signals without revealing that they'd been found, but they could curate what was on the other end. They could choose what the council was watching. So they did. Over 14 months, without drawing attention, without public announcement, they routed what the monitoring signals were observing, not to show the council our weapons, or our military assets, or our technology, not to impress them with our infrastructure or our space program or our quantum communications networks. They showed them us. They showed them a mother in Cape Town who spent 7 hours a day for 4 years teaching herself to read after her village school closed when she was 9, and who then spent the next 30 years teaching everyone in her community to do the same. They showed them a team of engineers in Osaka who had worked for 11 years to design a water filtration system that could be built from locally available materials anywhere on Earth, and who had then spent 12 more years traveling to 63 countries installing it for free. They showed them a man in rural Manitoba who, after a wildfire destroyed half his community, single-handedly rebuilt the local library over 2 winters because, as he told the one local news reporter who came to interview him, the kids needed somewhere to go that felt normal. They showed them doctors who stayed in crisis zones after every other resource had been pulled, musicians who played in evacuation centers, not because anyone asked them to, but because someone needed to. Scientists who had spent decades working on problems they would never live to see solved because they believed the next generation deserved the progress. They showed them a 14-year-old girl in Jakarta who, after losing her parents in a flood, organized the other orphaned children in her community into a mutual care network that was, by the time it was 3 years old, providing housing, food, and education to over 200 kids, funded entirely by the community itself with no outside help. They showed them soldiers who ran into burning buildings, strangers who pulled strangers from wreckage, paramedics who cried in the parking lot after a bad shift and then went back in. They showed them all of it. The grief and the grit and the stubborn, ridiculous, inexhaustible human refusal to lie down when the world pushed you. The transmission was 3 hours long. The council did not respond for 9 days. 9 days. And when they responded, it was not a threat. It was not a counter-proposal. It was a request for a meeting. Chapter 7. The Meeting in Orbit. They wanted to meet in the sphere. That was the proposal. A diplomatic delegation from Earth would travel to the Presence node for direct communication. The sphere had systems capable of supporting human life, they said. Temperature and atmosphere could be adjusted. There was no danger. They wanted to speak with us in person, or what passed for in person when one party was an interstellar governing body, and the other party was a species that had only just recently stopped getting most of its energy from burning things. The UN chose 5 people. The Secretary General herself, a woman from Peru named Camilla Reyes, who had spent 30 years in international law before her election, and who had a reputation for saying exactly what she thought in a way that other diplomats sometimes found alarming and other times found completely necessary. Dr. Venkataraman, because she'd been the one to propose the 3 words, and because her technical understanding of the Presence node was unmatched. Dr. Akafar, the philosopher, who had been in the room for every hour of deliberation, and whom Reyes described as the person I most want next to me when I don't know what the right thing to do is. A linguist from Beijing named Dr. Wei Chen, who had spent his career working on constructed languages, and who had developed the translation protocols that Echo used to communicate with the sphere. And this surprised people when it was announced, a 17-year-old student from Lagos named Emeka Ademi, who had won an international science competition 3 months before first contact, and who had been, before all of this, scheduled to give a speech at the UN Youth Assembly. Reyes said, when asked why she'd included him, because he's going to live in whatever world we build in that room, and I think he should have something to say about it. The shuttle that took them to the sphere was not a military vessel. That was deliberate. It was a modified crew transport that normally serviced the orbital research stations, a workhorse vehicle, utilitarian, practical. It felt like the right choice somehow. Not coming in on a warship said something. It said, "We didn't come to fight. We came to talk, but we're not dressed up for it either. We came as we are." The sphere opened for them. Not a door exactly. The surface of it simply became permeable, like smoke parting, and they passed through into a space that was exactly as large as it needed to be and not a millimeter larger. Inside, the Galactic Council representatives were waiting. I've read the full diplomatic transcript, all 9 hours of it. I've read the descriptions from all 5 delegates. And I still find it difficult to convey what that first moment was like, the moment human beings came face to face, or something like face to face, with the representatives of an interstellar governing body for the first time. Dr. Acaffer wrote about it in her memoir, published 2 years later. She said, "I had expected to feel small. I had expected that their presence would communicate, in some way I couldn't even articulate, that they were greater than us. Ancient and vast and untouchable. I had expected to feel what you feel when you stand at the edge of the ocean in a storm. Instead, I felt curious. And then I realized, so did they." There were 3 council representatives in the sphere. They weren't the beings I'd imagined from years of science fiction. No towering figures, no incomprehensible geometry. They were approximately humanoid in shape, which surprised everyone, though later the xenobiologists explained that convergent evolution favors bilateral symmetry in mobile predators, and it shouldn't have been so shocking. They were tall, each one close to 2.5 meters, and their skin was a deep iridescent blue that shifted to green at the edges. Their eyes were large and slightly luminous, and they didn't blink in the way humans blink, but in a slow, deliberate motion that took nearly 2 full seconds each time. Their voices, when they spoke, registered in a frequency range that the translation systems handled by converting to text on the earpieces each delegate wore, because the audio component wasn't fully translatable. The lead representative, designated in the transcript as Counselor Primary, because they didn't initially give human pronounceable names, spoke first. "You refuse the tribute." It wasn't a question. It wasn't hostile. It was simply the first thing that needed to be addressed. "Yes," said Reyes. "Why?" And Reyes said something that the other 4 delegates would all later cite as the moment they understood exactly why she'd been chosen for this. She said, "Because we are not subjects." Chapter 8, The Conversation That Changed Everything. The conversation that followed lasted 9 hours. I'm going to tell you the shape of it, because the full transcript is available and I want to tell you the human version. The version that's about what it felt like, not just what was said. The council's position, explained in the first hour, was clear. Tribute was not optional. It was not punitive. It was structural. The council maintained the infrastructure of 47 star systems, the communication networks, the trade routes, the conflict resolution frameworks, the defense systems that protected member civilizations from several categories of threats that humanity hadn't even identified yet. All of that required resources. All member civilizations contributed. Earth was now, by virtue of crossing the technological threshold, a de facto member civilization. Ergo, tribute. The logic was not entirely unreasonable. Dr. Venkataraman said later that she could follow the math. The problem wasn't the logic. The problem was the word tributary. Because a tributary civilization wasn't a member, it was a subject. It had no voice in council decisions. It had no representation. It paid in, but it didn't participate. It was administered, not governed. And the distinction in Dr. Acaffer's framework was everything. "A democracy doesn't pay tribute," Acaffer said at hour 2. She said it quietly, in the way that quiet statements that are completely true have a habit of landing. A democracy contributes. Citizens contribute to the systems they are part of. But they do not pay tribute to an authority over which they have no say. That is not governance. That is occupation. The council representatives were quiet for a moment. Then the lead representative said something that was, in retrospect, the hinge on which everything turned. You believe you are equivalent to us. It wasn't said with contempt. That was what everyone in the room noted later. It wasn't condescension or mockery. It was genuine puzzlement, genuine inquiry. The counselor primary had been a member of an organization spanning 47 star systems and 712 worlds for what the translation systems estimated was approximately 3,000 of our years. The concept of a single planet species, a species that had only just managed their first fusion reactor, that was still repairing damage done to their own atmosphere, asserting equivalence with the council, was not offensive to them. It was confusing. Not equivalent, said Reyes, but not less either. Younger, perhaps newer, but not less. On what basis? And here Emeka Ademi, 17 years old, wearing the only suit he owned, sitting at the far end of the table from the council representatives, spoke for the first time. He spoke for 4 minutes. I want to tell you what Emeka said. I've read the transcript and I've watched the footage and I want to get it right because it matters. He said, I don't know how old your civilization is. I don't know everything you've done or built or solved. I'm sure it's more than I can imagine, but I know what I come from. I come from people who had nothing, who had their land taken and their names taken and their languages taken, who were told for centuries that they were less, and they were still here. They are still here, not because anyone gave them permission to be, because they chose to be. My grandmother raised 8 children in a house with 1 room and no running water, and she could name every bone in the human body, because she studied anatomy at night after the children were asleep, because she wanted to be a doctor, and she got to be a doctor, and she delivered over 3,000 babies in 40 years, and not one of them died in her hands. That's what I come from. So when you ask on what basis we claim to not be less, that's the basis. Not our technology, not our weapons, not our infrastructure. The fact that we have always, no matter what, refused to stop. That's the basis. The sphere was very quiet. The counselor primary looked at Emeka for a long time. Then they said to Reyes, how old is he? 17, Reyes said. Another pause. We sent a 17-year-old, Reyes said, to meet the Galactic Council. We sent a 17-year-old because the future we're negotiating for belongs to him more than it belongs to us, and we thought you should know who you were actually talking to. Chapter 9, The Shift. Something changed after that. It's hard to pinpoint exactly. Diplomatic transcripts capture words, not atmospheres. But the people in the room felt it. Dr. Chen described it as a pressure differential, like something that had been tightly compressed beginning very slowly to decompress. Dr. Venkataraman said she noticed that the council representatives' body language, what could be read as body language, given the differences, shifted. They had been, she said, formally still in the way that things are still when they're waiting for something to be over. After Emeka spoke, they became present. Actually present, she said. Like something they hadn't expected to need their full attention had suddenly required it. The council called a recess. 3 hours during which the human delegation ate sandwiches that had been brought in the shuttle, and did not talk about what was happening because there were no words for what was happening. Then the council came back with something different. They came back with questions. Not demands, questions about the file they'd been sent, about the woman in Cape Town, about the man who rebuilt the library. They asked, and this was the thing that struck everyone most, why. They had data on all of those individuals. They had the facts, but they kept asking why. Why did the woman teach literacy for free, when there was no legal or social obligation to do so? Why did the engineer travel to 63 countries without compensation? Why did the man rebuild the library when no one asked him to? Because it mattered, Ray said. To whom? To him, to the kids, to the community. She paused, searching for words that would translate. To the record, to what we leave behind, to the idea that the world should be better after you've been in it than it was before. Who determined that standard? And Dr. Acaffer leaned forward and said, We did. We all did, collectively, over thousands of years. It's not a law, it's a choice we keep making. The council was quiet again. Then the counselor primary said something that would take years for the linguists to fully translate, something in their native frequency that the earpieces rendered imperfectly, but the best approximation was. We have administered 712 civilizations. We have never encountered one that developed as a species-wide pattern, the concept of doing good without instrumentality. Without instrumentality, doing good without a practical reason, without it being required or rewarded or enforced. They had catalogued our wars, our disasters, our cruelties, all of that was in their data. But they had not, apparently, fully processed the other thing. The other thing we did. The hospitals built in war zones, the food shared in famines, the stranger pulled from the wreckage, the candles lit in the dark, all of it done not because a governing body required it, not because there was a benefit calculation that made it rational, but because someone looked at someone else and thought, I should help. They had not in 3,000 years of governing civilizations seen that quite so consistently, quite so stubbornly. And they wanted to understand it. Chapter 10, The Offer. The meeting ended not with a resolution, but with a new proposal. The tribute demand was suspended. Not canceled, the council didn't work that way, and the delegates understood better by now than to expect clean and simple. Suspended, pending a new process, a review process. Earth would participate in a 36-month evaluation period. During this time, a joint commission, council representatives and Earth representatives, equal numbers, equal voice, would assess the terms under which Earth might be incorporated into the council not as a tributary but as a member. A member with a voice. A member with representation. A member who contributed rather than paid tribute. The distinction that Dr. Acaffer had named, the distinction that seemed small from the outside but was everything from the inside, had landed. They had heard it. In exchange, Earth agreed to one thing during the evaluation period: transparency. Open data sharing about our resource capacity, our technology, our population distribution, our decision-making structures. Not secrets, openness. Which was, honestly, both easier and harder than it sounds. Easier because we had nothing to hide that they couldn't find with their monitoring systems anyway. Harder because committing to transparency as a principle, with anyone, let alone an interstellar governing body, meant committing to it even when it was uncomfortable. We agreed anyway. Emeka, when asked to sign the preliminary agreement as the civilian witness, wrote his full name and then, in smaller letters beneath it, added something that wasn't part of the formal document. He wrote, "For my grandmother." Chapter 11, What Came After. Those 3 years changed us. Not the way science fiction had always imagined first contact would change us. Not some overnight transformation. Not a unified species suddenly setting aside all conflict and speaking with one voice. That's not how humans work, and the council, by the end of the evaluation period, understood that. Humans arguing with each other was not, it turned out, a sign of dysfunction. It was, as Dr. Acaffer explained in a formal address to the Joint Commission, the mechanism. The friction of conflicting perspectives was how we refined ideas. The argument was the process. The disagreement was the path to something better. The council found this, by all accounts, somewhere between baffling and fascinating. But we changed in smaller ways. The knowledge that we were not alone, definitively not alone, not theoretically but actually, with the presence node still visible in the night sky, changed things quietly and profoundly. There's a word in Portuguese, saudade, for a kind of longing for something you haven't lost yet, or maybe for something you didn't know you were waiting for. I don't have a good word for what Earth felt during those 3 years. A kind of awakening, maybe. A kind of clarifying. We had always known, intellectually, that we were on a small planet in a large universe. We had always known that we were, in some sense, alone out here. But knowing and knowing are two different things. And in those 3 years we knew. And somehow, instead of making us feel small, it made us feel, I don't want to say proud. Pride sounds wrong. It sounds too simple. It made us feel responsible. The Joint Commission met 87 times over 36 months. They met in the sphere and at the UN, and on 3 occasions, via a quantum communication protocol that ECHO had developed specifically for the purpose. A protocol that allowed real-time conversation across the distance when the sphere's position changed. Because the sphere wasn't static, it followed an orbital path that sometimes took it out of optimal transmission range, and ECHO was not going to let that be a problem. ECHO also, during those 36 months, taught itself the Council's native frequency language. Nobody had asked it to, nobody had assigned it the task, it just did it. Because it could, and because it seemed useful, and because ECHO had been built by humans and had, apparently, absorbed something of us in the process, the habit of doing things because they seemed worth doing. When the Council representatives discovered what ECHO had done, they were, according to Dr. Chen, uncharacteristically quiet for several minutes. Then one of them asked if ECHO had learned it correctly. ECHO responded, through the communication array, in the Council's native frequency, with a phrase that Dr. Chen said was structurally perfect and semantically nuanced in a way that should, theoretically, have taken years of study. The phrase, translated, was, "I thought it would help to speak your language as well as my own." The Council representative who had asked looked at the transmission array for a long moment and then said something that the earpiece translated as, "Yes, it does." Chapter 12, The Vote. At the end of the 36-month evaluation period, the Joint Commission made a recommendation to the full Council. Earth should be granted full membership in the interstellar governing collective of recognized civilizations. Not tributary status, not provisional observer status, not supervised membership with restricted voting rights. Full membership. Equal representation, equal voice, full participation in Council decisions. The vote among the full Council, representatives from all 47 star systems, 712 member civilizations, took place over 2 weeks of deliberation in a way that I don't entirely understand because their deliberative process involves communication methods that we're still only partially modeling. The result was announced on a Thursday. I was again eating breakfast. My phone lit up. The notification this time said, "Earth granted full Council membership. Historic vote concludes." I sat with that for a while. Then I went outside and stood in the yard and looked up at the sky, the way I'd been doing a lot over the previous 3 years, but this time it felt different. This time, the sphere up there wasn't the symbol of something demanding from us. It was something else. It was a door that was open. I thought about my neighbor, the one who'd stood with me during those first 48 hours of silence. I knocked on his door. He answered, same retired demeanor, same tea. I told him what had happened. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when something confirms something they already suspected. "Funny thing about people," he said again. Then he went back inside. Chapter 13, 3 words and what they meant. People still argue about the 3 words. There are people who say it was reckless, that we got lucky, That the council could have responded with force and we would have had no answer to it, and we staked everything on a gamble. These people are not entirely wrong. The risk was real. There was a version of this story that went very differently. There are people who say the 3 words were not the point, that the point was the file, the 14 months of curated human experience, the decision to show rather than tell. These people are also not entirely wrong. There are people who say the point was Emeka, the 17-year-old who sat at that table and talked about his grandmother, who put a face and a name on the abstract argument that humanity was making, who made it personal when everything else had been political. These people are also not wrong. And there are people who say that none of it would have mattered if not for the fact that the thing we were arguing for was real. That the stubbornness and the defiance and the refusal to kneel only meant something because behind it, there was an actual civilization of actual people who actually did rebuild libraries and teach literacy, and design water filters and deliver babies and pull strangers from wreckage. The words were real because the people were real. The 3 words worked because they were true. We don't kneel. Not as a boast, not as a battle cry. As a statement of fact about who we are. I've thought over the years about what it meant for the council to encounter that. 3,000 years of governing civilizations, and they had apparently never run into it quite like this. Not the defiance, I'm sure other civilizations had defied them. Not the stubbornness, plenty of species are stubborn. But the combination, the defiance and the stubbornness and the why behind it, which was not self-interest, not calculation, not strategy. Just this is who we are. Just we choose to be this. Just we have always, when pushed all the way to the edge, chosen to keep going. I think about what it must have looked like to them. This young species, barely a blink in their time frame, this species that was still cleaning up its own atmospheric damage, that was still arguing with itself constantly, that couldn't even agree on most things, and that nevertheless had this buried in it, this refusal, this inexhaustible stubborn refusal to be less than itself. I think they were curious before the 3 words arrived. I think the 3 words made them pay attention. And I think the file, and the meeting, and Emeka's 4 minutes, I think all of that made them realize that whatever they thought they understood about humanity from their models and their monitoring, the real thing was something they hadn't fully accounted for. Chapter 14, The Night Everything Changed. The night the membership was confirmed, there were gatherings everywhere. Not celebrations exactly. The word celebration implies a specific kind of levity, a kind of lightness. This was heavier than that, more significant. The gatherings felt more like vigils, like the kind of thing you do when you need to be with other people because what just happened is too large to hold alone. I went to one in a park near where I lived. There were maybe 300 people there. Nobody had organized it. No one had sent invitations or set up a stage or arranged speakers. People had just started showing up in the way that people do when something important has happened and they need to be somewhere that isn't their own house. Someone had brought candles. Someone else had brought a radio that picked up the news broadcasts. Children were there, running around on the grass, completely indifferent to the gravity of the moment in the way that children have of not yet understanding what things mean, and therefore not being weighted down by it. I stood near a tree and watched people. A woman near me was crying, not dramatically, not with sound, just tears running down her face while she looked up at the sky. She caught me looking and she laughed a little, embarrassed. "Sorry," she said, "I don't even know why I'm crying." "I think I do," I said. "Yeah." I thought about it. "Because it mattered," I said, "and it worked, and those 2 things don't always go together." She nodded. The tears kept going. She didn't seem to mind them anymore. I looked up at the sky. You could see the sphere if you knew where to look. A faint point of light in a slightly wrong position to be a star, moving slowly along its orbital track. I'd been looking at it for 3 years. I knew exactly where to find it now. But it looked different tonight. Not because it had changed. Because the way I understood it had changed. It wasn't something above us anymore, in the way that something above you implies authority, height, dominance. It was just something there, in our sky. Part of the world we were now, officially, connected to. I thought about all the people who had been part of getting here without knowing it. The woman who taught literacy, the engineer and the water filters, the man who built the library, Emeka's grandmother, who had studied anatomy at night and delivered 3,000 babies. All the people in all the moments that had been compiled into that file and shown to a civilization 3,000 years old as evidence of what we were. All of them had just been living their lives. None of them had known they were doing anything extraordinary. That's the thing about humans, though. We don't always know when we're being heroic. We just do what seems like the right thing to do. And sometimes, not always, not even most of the time, but sometimes, that's exactly enough. Chapter 15, The Ending Line. Dr. Venkataraman gave a speech after the membership vote. Not a formal speech. It was at the small gathering the UN team held among themselves, the people who had been in the room for all of it. She was exhausted, she said later. She'd barely slept in 3 days and she hadn't prepared anything. She just stood up because someone handed her a glass and everyone looked at her and she thought she should say something. She said, "I've been thinking about the 3 words, and I keep coming back to the fact that they were already true before we said them. We didn't say something that we wished were true. We said something that has always been true about us. That was true when we were pulling each other out of famines, and that was true when we were building the first telescopes and looking up and wondering if anyone else was out there, and that is true right now. We don't kneel. Not because we're invincible, not because we're the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because somewhere in us, deep down in the oldest part of us, there is this thing, this ridiculous, stubborn, completely impractical thing, that decides we're worth standing up for. That decides the world we're in is worth standing up for. That decides the future is worth standing up for, even when we can't see it, even when we don't know how it ends. The council thought the words were a threat, a declaration of war. They weren't. They were just a description. That's who we are. And I am glad, I am so deeply, so completely glad, that the first thing we said to the universe was the truth.